Today, St. Patrick's Day is famous for crowded bars, green drinks, and lively celebrations. But what if I told you the biggest Irish holiday once had no drinking at all? For decades in Ireland, on March 17th, pubs were legally required to close their doors. No pints, no bar crowds, no pub celebrations. The very place people now gather to celebrate was shut, and that strange rule is only the beginning. Because what if I also told you St. Patrick wasn't even Irish? Ireland never had snakes to begin with. Leprechauns weren't the friendly little creatures you think they were, and the color everyone wears on this day wasn't always green. The real history of St. Patrick's Day includes surprising traditions, forgotten laws, and symbols that weren't always what they seem. In fact, almost everything you think you know about this holiday is wrong. But to understand how the holiday changed so dramatically and why so many myths grew up around it, we need to go back to its earliest origins. Long before parades and parties, St. Patrick's Day looked very different. And the man at the center of it all, he had a secret most people never learned. The day honors St. Patrick, the missionary traditionally credited with spreading Christianity across Ireland in the 5th century. But here's the first surprise. St. Patrick was N-T-I-R-S-H St. Patrick. The man celebrated every March 17th as the symbol of Irish identity was not born in Ireland. He was born in Roman Britain, sometime in the late 4th century. His real name was likely Maewyn Succat, not Patrick. That name came later, and his connection to Ireland. It began with tragedy. When he was just a teenager, maybe 16 years old, Irish raiders attacked his family's estate. They kidnapped him, dragged him across the sea to Ireland, and sold him into slavery. For 6 years, he worked as a shepherd in captivity, alone, cold, afraid. He later wrote that during those years, he turned to prayer, to faith, to God. And one night, he heard a voice telling him to escape. So he did. He walked nearly 200 miles to the coast, found a ship, and made his way back to Britain, home, free. Most people would never return to the place where they'd been enslaved, but Patrick did. Years later, after studying Christianity, he chose to go back to Ireland as a missionary. The holiday that celebrates Irish identity therefore honors someone who began his life far from the island, someone who returned by choice, someone who chose forgiveness over bitterness, and that choice would change Ireland forever. But the legends that grew up around him, some of them are stranger than you'd believe, because the most famous story about St. Patrick, the one about the snakes, isn't what it seems. The snakes of Ireland, one of the most famous legends about St. Patrick, claims he drove every snake out of Ireland. According to the story, he stood on a hill, some say it was Croagh Patrick, in County Mayo, and banished the reptiles into the sea, freeing the island forever. Churches across Ireland tell this story. Children grow up hearing it. It's one of the defining images of the saint, standing tall, staff in hand, commanding the snakes to leave. But here's the problem. Ireland likely never had snakes in the first place. After the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago, rising sea levels separated Ireland from mainland Europe. Snakes hadn't migrated to the island yet, and once the water rose, they couldn't get there. Scientists and historians agree. Ireland has been snake-free for thousands of years, not because of St. Patrick, because of geography. So why does the legend exist? Many scholars believe the story is symbolic. The snakes represented paganism, the old beliefs that existed in Ireland before Christianity arrived. When Patrick spread his faith, he wasn't driving out actual reptiles. He was replacing ancient traditions with new ones. Druids, sacred groves, old gods, those were the snakes. And slowly, they faded. Not through violence, not through force, but through persuasion, through teaching, through conversion. But the real story was more gradual, more complicated, and far more human. Still, the snake story stuck, because people love a good legend. And legends, it turns out, shape holidays just as much as history does. But if the snakes weren't real, what about the other symbols? The shamrock, the color green, the leprechauns? Surely those are ancient Irish traditions, right? Not quite. 3 parts: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit existing as one. The story goes that Patrick was teaching a group of Irish people about this concept. They didn't understand. How can 3 be 1? So Patrick bent down, picked a shamrock from the ground, and held it up. Look, he said. 3 leaves, 1 stem, 3 parts, 1 plant, the Holy Trinity. Whether this moment truly happened is impossible to know. Patrick himself never mentioned it in his writings. The story doesn't appear in historical records until centuries later. But true or not, it endured. Over time, the shamrock became one of the most recognizable symbols of Ireland itself. It appeared on decorations, clothing, flags, and eventually St. Patrick's Day celebrations around the world. A simple 3-leaf plant transformed into a global icon. But here's where things get interesting, because even the color of that shamrock, the color everyone associates with this holiday, wasn't always what you'd expect. In fact, the color most people wear on St. Patrick's Day today wasn't always green. The green versus blue mystry green is everywhere on St. Patrick's Day. Green decorations, green clothing, even rivers dyed bright emerald. But historically, the color connected to St. Patrick was actually blue, not green. Blue. Historians sometimes call it St. Patrick's blue, a shade used in early Irish symbols and heraldry. Old paintings of St. Patrick show him wearing blue robes. The British Order of St. Patrick used blue in its insignia. For centuries, that was the color of the saint. So how did green take over? The answer lies in Ireland's landscape and national identity. As Irish cultural pride grew in the 18th and 19th centuries, green became associated with the country itself, the lush countryside, the nickname Emerald Isle, and the growing use of the shamrock symbol. Wearing green became an act of Irish rebellion during British rule, a quiet way to say, "We are Irish, we are proud." Slowly, green replaced blue and became the defining color of the holiday. And once that happened, the traditions started to grow. Small traditions, family traditions, the kind that create childhood memories. But not all of those traditions were as innocent as they seemed. Especially one tiny creature that became a symbol of the holiday. A creature that, in the old stories, was far more dangerous than you'd think. Leprechauns were not always fairy and Del White-a-day. Leprechauns appear as cheerful cartoon mascots, little men in green coats and buckled hats, dancing, smiling, handing out pots of gold. They're on cereal boxes in parades. On greeting cards, friendly, harmless, cute. But in traditional Irish folklore, these creatures were very different. Leprechauns were considered solitary fairy beings who guarded hidden treasure. They lived alone, in hollow trees or underground burrows, and they did not like humans. If you managed to catch one and, the old stories say, this was nearly impossible. You could force him to reveal the location of his gold. But you had to keep your eyes on him, because the moment you looked away, he'd vanish. Or worse, he'd trick you, lead you into a bog, make you chase shadows, curse you with bad luck. Leprechauns in the old tales were clever, mischievous, and sometimes cruel. They played tricks on farmers. They spoiled milk. They caused mischief. They were not your friends. The friendly version seen in modern decorations and advertisements developed much later, especially as St. Patrick's Day became a global celebration. Companies turned them into mascots, movies made them cute, and slowly, the dangerous trickster became a harmless cartoon. But the old Irish farmers who told stories around the fire, they wouldn't have smiled at a leprechaun. They would have avoided one. And speaking of things that aren't as old as you think, that green beer you see everywhere on St. Patrick's Day, that's not an ancient Irish tradition either. Green beer has become a familiar sight in many St. Patrick's Day celebrations, especially in North America. Bars serve it by the pitcher. People post photos of it on social media. It's become part of the holiday. Yet the tradition is relatively modern. Historians trace the practice back to the early 20th century in the United States. A bartender, probably in New York, decided it would be fun to add a small amount of dye to beer as a novelty for St. Patrick's Day parties. The colorful drink quickly became associated with the festivities, and it spread, bar to bar, city to city, even though it had little connection to older Irish customs. In fact, if you'd tried to order green beer in Ireland during most of the 20th century, you would have run into a problem: the pub closure law. Because in 1903, Ireland officially recognized St. Patrick's Day as a public holiday. But lawmakers believed the day should remain religious in nature, so they introduced a rule. All pubs had to close. Across the country on March 17th, bar doors stayed locked. Imagine that today. The biggest Irish holiday, and the pubs were closed. This rule stayed in place for decades. Until the 1970s, people in Ireland could not legally celebrate St. Patrick's Day inside a pub. No drinking, no toasts, no gatherings. The day was for mass, for family meals, for quiet reflection, not for parties. The day fell during Lent, and there was another reason celebrations stayed modest. St. Patrick's Day falls during the Christian season of Lent, a period traditionally associated with fasting and restraint. For centuries, people avoided big celebrations because of these religious customs. However, churches often allowed a temporary pause in the strict Lenten rules for the feast day itself. This small exception made the day feel special, one of the few moments of celebration during an otherwise reflective season. But it was still quiet, still small, still centered around faith, not festivals. So if Ireland wasn't hosting huge parties and parades, where did the modern celebration come from? The answer might surprise you. One of the most surprising facts about St. Patrick's Day is that the earliest major parades took place in America, not Ireland, America. In the 1700s, Irish immigrants began organizing celebrations in cities like New York. For them, the holiday was more than a religious feast. It was a way to celebrate Irish identity and culture in a new country. A country where they faced discrimination, where signs said no Irish need apply, where they were called criminals, drunks, undesirable. So they marched, thousands of them, through the streets of New York, Boston, Philadelphia. They wore their Sunday best. They carried banners, they played music, they showed the world. We are here. We are Irish. We are proud. Soon the parades grew larger. Chicago developed some of the biggest celebrations in the world, and in the 1960s someone had an idea. What if we dyed the Chicago River green? A plumber noticed that a dye used to trace leaks turned the water bright green. Let's do that on purpose, he said, and they did. Each year in Chicago, the Chicago River is dyed a vivid green. Crowds gather along the riverbanks as the water slowly changes color. It became one of the most famous St. Patrick's Day events anywhere in the world, a far cry from the quiet observances of earlier centuries. And eventually, the festive version of St. Patrick's Day traveled back across the Atlantic to Ireland itself. By the 1970s, Ireland began opening pubs on the holiday, creating festivals, welcoming tourists. They looked at what America had created and thought, maybe we should try that. The holiday was once a quiet village, CEO, Ibea one, but it's worth remembering what the holiday used to be. For much of its history, St. Patrick's Day was not the massive public event many people imagine today. In rural communities across Ireland, the day often centered around church services and small family gatherings. Villages might decorate modestly or share a meal together. Children wore green clothing sometimes to avoid the playful tradition of being pinched if they forgot. Families baked themed treats, and many children searched fields or yards hoping to find a lucky four-leaf clover. Schools decorated classrooms with paper shamrocks. These were quiet moments of celebration, simple traditions that often became childhood memories. The atmosphere remained calm and reflective, not loud, not public, not commercial. Only in the 20th century did large parades, international tourism, and city festivals transform the holiday into the lively spectacle now recognized around the world. Really, a story about how traditions evolve and how myths become more powerful than facts? A man who wasn't Irish became Ireland's patron saint? Snakes that never existed were driven out. A solemn religious feast became a worldwide party. Blue became green. Dangerous fairy creatures became cartoon mascots. And for much of its history in Ireland, the pubs people now associate with the holiday were closed. The truth is, almost nothing about modern St. Patrick's Day is what it seems. But maybe that's okay, because traditions don't have to be ancient to be meaningful. They just have to matter to the people celebrating them. So the next time March 17th arrives with green decorations, lively parades, and crowded celebrations, you might remember that the real history of St. Patrick's Day is far more surprising than most people realize. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten traditions and surprising stories from history, consider subscribing for more videos like this. And in the comments below, I want to know which myths surprised you most. The snakes that never existed, St. Patrick not being Irish, the pubs being closed, leprechauns being dangerous? Share your thoughts below. And if you remember St. Patrick's Day from when you were growing up, the paper shamrocks in school, the green milk, the fear of getting pinched, tell me about it. Sometimes the smallest traditions are the ones that keep history alive.